How's it going, guys? This is Ryo Murata, photographer based in Tokyo. This is going to be, how should I say it, like appeal more towards the digital shooters and maybe some people who shoot with film. Probably you guys get your film negatives scanned and after that you will edit on a laptop or desktop computer. And in today's video, we'll like to talk about the importance of having a scratch disk. I myself am not a computer geek or anything. Well, I built my own PC, but I have basic knowledge, so I wanted to sort of like showcase you guys like what a scratch disk is and why you might benefit of using it, and probably might be a good idea to invest in a scratch disk. So what is a scratch disk? A scratch disk is basically an external SSD. SSD stands for solid state drive that you basically edit your photos on. That's basically it. And hopefully anyone who has a laptop or desktop computer, I myself, like I said, built my own PC, and when I'm editing, I'm always use a scratch disk to edit my photos. And I'm not sure where this word came from. Probably it came from the videography, cinematography, and YouTubers side of the world. But basically, when you have a computer or a desktop computer, you have an operating software which is basically located on a sort of like a solid state drive in most cases. And while that program is being run on that solid state drive, your other programs such as Photoshop, Lightroom, Capture One Pro, which I use, and when I edit video, DaVinci Resolve, and some YouTubers might use Premiere Pro, that program is also like running on the background of that solid state drive. And what I'm trying to say is that like it's really hard to explain, but when you continue to use your computer, it's taxing on that specific solid state drive which the operating software is running on. And on top of that, when you start editing, you're basically, what's happening is you're sort of like shaving off the lifespan of the solid state drive. And when you look in long term, like it's highly likely that that solid state drive that's located in your laptop or in your desktop will fail at a faster rate compared to having a scratch disk. Really nothing wrong about the process of sort of like having that operating software in the program, and on top of that editing any kind of file within that exact same drive. But you have that risk of sort of like damaging the solid state drive within the computer or laptop, which can become expensive when you want to get maintenance or repaired, and that's going to take a couple of weeks to get it fixed. So in my experience, I never had those kinds of issues yet, but I wanted to sort of like prevent that from happening, so I basically invested in a scratch disk. And if you keep doing this read writes, especially when you're doing video in a hard task, actually, it's gonna tax the computer even more. So by having sort of like an external drive to edit on, you can basically decrease the amount of risk of system failure within your system. But as a tech person might say, for the solid state drives, there are two varieties. One is a SATA SSD, and that's basically the budget option, which they're basically equally matched across the plane. So they have like roughly 500 megabytes per second of read and write, and across various manufacturers, that's basically the standard. It won't deviate around that area much. And another one is a more expensive Nvme type of SSDs, which are a little bit more expensive. The main difference between the Nvme SSD and the SATA is basically SATA connects using a SATA cable, which is basically the exact same cable you use to plug in an not external, but like a 3.5-inch external standard like hard drives to your computer, while the sort of like the Nvme uses an Nvme type of like connection port. And when you put that drive into the case, you can basically connect to your laptop or your computer using a USB-C cable, while the SATA SSDs tend to connect using a USB 3.0 older type of like cable. And also, not to mention that the major difference is the size. The SATA SSD is much more bulkier, and it's not heavy, but it's like plasticky, and it takes up place, while the Nvme is like half that size and it's easy to like carry and transport. Oh yeah, I forgot, there is a variant of SSDs called M.2, which came after SATA SSDs before Nvme. It has the same form factor as an Nvme, but the connection method is a little bit different, and there are cases meant for, keep this in mind, there's a case meant for M.2 which won't work for NVMe, while there are cases meant for NVMe which are not meant for M.2, so don't get that mismatch. And if I were you, just ignore the M.2 because the transfer speed of M.2 is exactly the same as the SATA SSDs, while NVMe is much more faster and you will benefit more from that. So keep that in mind. And what's interesting about the NVMe's is price-wise, compared to SATA SSDs, they're basically the exact same price across the board. However, NVMe's, there are entry levels and high ends. I ignore the high ends because they're like really expensive. The entry levels are less than $100 now. Like 500 gigabytes is like $40. 1 terabyte's less than $100 for the entry level. I went with a brand called Kioxia, which is basically a Japanese company that sort of like broke off from Toshiba's semiconductors, like, I don't know what you would call Toshiba's semiconductors division, because their management is going really bad right now, and they sort of broke off and made a division specifically for these external drives and stuff like that, drives and stuff. And they have a joint venture with Western Digital, which you guys know, famous like company making hard drives and SSDs. And also their entry level sort of like drive, like I said, is less than $100. And however, they go up to 1,700 megabytes per second when read and write. So that's like 3-4 times faster than the typical SATA SSD. And if like time is money, a lot of people might say that, you know, you can benefit more of having a sort of like an NVMe around this like speed. And I keep saying this over and over again, but NVMe's, there are entry levels and high end, and if you have the money, I guess it might be worth to invest upfront for a more expensive drive, because there are now like drives that go up to 7,300 megabytes per second. It's like 7 gigabytes per second on transfer, and that's like 5 times more than the entry level that I just mentioned, the Kioxia's like sort of like drive that I purchased. However, it costs like what, 3, 4, 5 times more expensive than the entry level. So I mean, if money's a factor, maybe the entry level, you might benefit more from that. And if you have the money, I guess go for the more expensive ones. But keep this in mind that the more faster you go for these NVMe drives, they sort of like release tremendous amount of heat. So you need to find a case, a really good case to sort of like cool it off, because if you continue to sort of like transfer like gigabytes of files within a short period of time, you're gonna sort of like overheat that sort of like drive, and it might sort of bottleneck and get slower. And this is sort of like a great thing about the entry level NVMe's, because these drives go a little bit slower than the high-end ones. They don't like release tremendous amount of heat, so you can basically transfer at a moderate rate of like maybe 1 gigabyte per second for like 10-20 minutes or so before it starts to bottleneck and stuff like that. So keep that in mind. Basically the story of what a scratch disk is, and I forgot to explain that scratch disk is, I mean, there's like 2 types of like external drives. One is basically companies that make the all-in-one package. You guys probably see a lot of photographers carrying around a Sandisk Extreme Pro like external drive, maybe, or maybe a Western Digital My Passport series of SSD. Those are like basically all-in-one solutions where you just plug and play and maybe format it and you can use it from there. However, those are really expensive, and I just wanted to make this video because by DIYing a scratch disk or an external drive, it's much more cheaper. You can shave off roughly 1/3 the cost of like purchasing from the on-brand companies that make those all-in-one solutions. And it's like really simple because you just need the drive itself, the SSD driver itself, and then an enclosure and maybe a screwdriver. I myself went with a company called Sabrent, like enclosure with the Kioxia drive. And the great thing about this company is that you don't need a screwdriver. You can just press the button and just open it up and just slide in the SSDs, and there's already a sort of like a screw in there which you basically screw it in, and that's basically it. And there's already a sort of like a rubber, not rubber, a silicon, what's the word, thermal pad, which basically like sort of like I can't, what's my English going? But there's this thermal pad which basically absorbs the heat coming away from the NVMe and basically transfer it to the aluminum shell around it. So you can basically do a lot of transfer during that, process. And the same goes for the SATA SSDs. You basically get the case, remove the bottom like lid, slide in the SSD nice and slow, and the case itself, and you're done. That sounds wrong, but it's really simple, and just plug in the USB cable to your computer and format it, and you're done actually. Okay, so basically that's it, and I keep forgetting a lot of things. So how I use this is I use it as an external drive actually. So I basically scan all my like film negatives from my Epson GTX 830 V550 North America onto this drive and basically run Photoshop. And I don't use Lightroom unfortunately, except when I'm like editing CineStuff, like color negatives. I basically edit everything in here, and also I basically edit all my YouTube videos in here. So, and I keep saying this over and over again, if your computer's SSD crashes, that's an expensive expense. However, if this crashes, which is less likely because you're not running your operating software on this, you're just editing photos, editing videos on this, this is actually going to live pretty long actually, like probably not less, but more than a decade if you handle it correctly. And because these what you call NVMEs have compared to when they first came out, they did not, these what you call flash storages did not last long. They had a less lifespan than the hard drive, but now these things actually live pretty long compared to hard drives. Now hard drives are probably 5-6 years average. This might last more than that, probably a decade or so. And as an investment of less than $100, it is in my case worth it. And even if this crash, it's $100, and I can basically replace the inner compartment by just sliding this out, and can it focus in? Focus. Oh. Focus. And you can basically untighten the screw and just yank out the don't yank it out, but you could take out the the drive out of this case and basically put a new drive in, and you basically close it and format it and good to go. So hopefully